Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the Brian Dainsberg podcast, Christian Living in a Complicated World. I'm your host, Brian Dainsberg, lead pastor of Alliance Bible Church, located in beautiful southeast Wisconsin. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest. This is a historic moment. First guest outside of the ABC ecosystem on this podcast. This is a story you'll be telling your grandkids, Abigail. And we have Dr. Abigail Favale. Do I pronounce that right?
That was great.
Great.
You're a pro.
Great. She is a writer and professor in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. Her essays and short stories have appeared in publications such as First Things, The Atlantic, Church Life, and Potomac Review. She has written a book entitled The Genesis of Gender, which is what brought us to this spot to have a conversation about it. And a book, by the way, I should get this out there, a book I highly recommend you get. Christmas is coming, and this is a gift that you should get. My wife and I have this saying when it comes to gifts with our kids: we get you something you want, something you need, something to wear, and something to read.
Ooh, I like that.
So, listeners, this can fill that spot of getting somebody in your life something to read. The Genesis of Gender by Dr. Abigail Favale. Abigail, thanks for being with us today. Before we talk shop, tell us a little bit about your family.
Sure. Well, I'm married to my husband, Michael. We've been married for, hold on, let me do the math. Like 17 years,
Wow.
Which does not seem possible, but
Yeah,
that's accurate. Yep. Okay.
17.
And we have 4 kids, 3 boys, 1 girl. My oldest just turned 11 yesterday, so I've been a mother for 11 years.
11
And my
years.
youngest is a 3-year-old boy. So
Okay.
you've got kind of a spread there.
Yeah, and so there's never a dull day.
That is correct. It's a whirlwind, my oldest just started getting into the activities, and it might be a little, I kind of might have to tell him, like, look, this is not sustainable, man. You can't do everything. But
Yeah.
he had his first basketball game this weekend, which was really fun. But also I was like, oh, I understand how parents get really into this, to an extent that might not be healthy, kind of like,
Yeah.
because it's so exciting and it was fun.
Yeah. I've got an 11-year-old as well, so I get it. Yeah. It's an active time of year.
Yeah.
Okay, the Genesis of Gender, for our listeners, just kind of whet their appetite a little bit. Take a couple minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes, whatever. Give us an overview of what the book's about.
Sure. Well, to contextualize it just a little bit, so my own background academically is in feminist studies and gender theory and literature. And so I've been kind of immersed in that world for a long time, and then had a kind of reversion back to Christianity about 10 years ago. And since then I've been writing about gender, but from a Christian perspective, but with this kind of insider knowledge, I guess, of that world. And so I wrote The Genesis of Gender with the hope that it would help other Christians, other people of faith, to better navigate the terrain that we're in culturally at this time related to gender. So the title is The Genesis of Gender, and it's kind of true in 2 ways. So the first way in which the book is about the genesis of gender is that I tell kind of the more or less linear story of how the concept of gender evolved and how it's come to mean the many things that it means in our time over the last 70 or 80 years or so. And then I draw that kind of worldview, that gender paradigm, into comparison with what I call the Genesis paradigm, which would be kind of the Christian worldview and the understanding of gender within that context. And so in that sense, it's the genesis of gender, as in, like, well, what is, when we look at gender through the light of Genesis, what do we see? So that's the book in a nutshell.
Yeah.
I would say.
It's one thing to be able to write a book like this. It's another to pull the trigger and do it. I'm sure you had a sense of what waters you were wading into when you wrote it. So why write it? Yes, you can. You have the ability to, you got the background, the experience, but why decide to write it?
Yeah, that's a good question. One, I'm just really interested in gender. It's been a long-standing interest of mine since I was an undergraduate. And I don't know why that is. Sometimes I have friends that are like, so when are you going to get bored? Like, I don't know. Things are just getting weirder. So it's more and more, it's more interesting than ever. But, I actually started out writing a different book. I actually started out writing a book about feminism and Christianity. And then when I started writing the chapter on gender, it just kept growing and growing and growing. Mm-hmm. So when you're in the writing process, this is something I'm actually pretty good at doing this. I think when you're in the writing process, you almost like have to just be totally in the trenches at that point, and you're just being faithful to the work. You're just writing this book that is kind of coming into being. Mm-hmm. And you have to bracket questions of how will this be received? Will anyone read this, right? You just have to almost totally compartmentalize those thoughts. And then deal with them when the book comes out, Yeah. And then it's like, what did I do? And I think the topic had heated up even more so when it came out than when I was writing it. In fact, when I was writing it, I kind of thought, that when I was writing it, the first wave of detransitioners was coming out on social media, and I thought, oh, this thing's over. Maybe I've missed the boat. Like by the time this book comes out, we will have kind of turned the corner already. But that is obviously not what happened.
Right. I have to say, I wasn't expecting an entire chapter on the waves of feminism in a book on the gender paradigm. Mm-hmm. And even now, there's still, I'm still trying to put pieces together. So help our listeners understand why include a chapter on feminism in a book about the kind of the transgender craze that's going on now.
Mm-hmm. So the concept of gender and how it evolved in the last century is inextricably bound up with the feminist movement and feminist theory. And I think that's something that people don't realize, which is part of the story that I wanted to tell, because that's how, I have like graduate degrees in feminist theory and gender theory. And so you can even sort of track this shift if you're vaguely aware that at universities there used to be women's studies departments, and then there was a time probably in the late 90s, early 2000s where you started to see women's and gender studies departments, right? And you might still see that framing sometimes, but now it's mostly gender studies, right? So it's almost, the woman has almost entirely dropped off. So that's just kind of like a tiny microcosm of the shift that I think has happened, where you had kind of a feminist theory and how gender functioned within feminist theory, but then it kind of began to gain its own momentum and become gender theory. And then at that point, gender theory it's almost like this Pac-Man, like that swallowed up everything else. But you can't really understand this movement. I mean, kind of where we are without understanding how feminism itself, in a kind of ironic sense, considering the now erasure of woman in our discourse, but how feminism itself kind of contributed to that evolution.
Did feminism start off good?
That's a good question. So feminism, and what we call like first wave feminism, right? You think immediately of the suffrage movement, so the right for women to vote. So feminism arose in a context that was it was really responding to the situation of women in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, where you had this significant upending in society, and a lot of work shifted away from kind of the agrarian homestead to factories. And so women who weren't able to afford to stay at home, would be working in like terrible conditions, or women who could afford to stay at home were like newly sort of siloed in the home in a way that you weren't pre-Industrial Revolution, in a way that I think we sometimes overlook. So there were very real problems that the first feminist movement was trying to respond to. And there was actually an emphasis in first wave feminism on kind of women's moral sensibilities and how important it was for those to have a voice in the public sphere, and how important it was for wives and mothers to, have a say in some of the ways that our country was being shaped, especially in a moral sense. So I think there was definitely some good stuff there. I think where things went awry is when the feminist movement became, in the second wave, really bound up with the values and goals of the sexual revolution. And that's where things, I think, took a turn that has taken us to the place where we are now.
Right. And you also talk about in your book that obviously feminism wasn't the only kind of tributary that fed the gender confusion that we have today, but you talk about the objectification of women as well, and you talk about gender stereotypes. Discuss a little bit about how that helped feed also this, where we are today.
Yeah. So to take that first, the kind of sexualization or hypersexualization of women, that follows up on what I was just saying about the values and goals of the sexual revolution. So one of the pieces of the story, so I kind of tell this story both in terms of a conceptual revolution, so changing understandings of what gender means, but also a technological revolution. So you can't really tell this story apart from advances in technology as well, primarily technologies that change the kind of normal physiology of the body. So the first really relevant technology, I think, is contraception, hormonal contraception. And so once our society really embraced that in this kind of widespread wholesale way, I think it shifted our cultural imagination on what sex even means as far as male and female. So instead of maleness and femaleness being primarily about our capacities for motherhood and fatherhood, our procreative capacities, that we kind of severed that link in our kind of imaginations. And so being a woman, being a man, it had much more to do with roles you perform in society. It had much more to do with what you look like, and it has much more to do with how sexuality is portrayed, especially through pornography. And so there's a big emphasis in those sort of narratives about women that really root what it means to be a woman, not actually in our generativity, but in women as sex objects, right? So I think that's a big piece as well, because once we kind of uproot man and woman from what really grounds the distinction between men and women, which is one of us has the potential to gestate, one of us has the potential to generate outside of oneself, right? Then it really becomes much more about stereotypes or presentation or sexual role. And that's what we're seeing now, right? Where that's kind of what it means to be a woman now, is to assume a certain external role, it's to look a certain way, it's to play a certain sexual role. And it's very, very cut off and very distant from the realm of procreation.
Yeah. So now that's related, at least in my mind, it's related to the influence of postmodernity and this kind of constructionist versus essentialist approach to the world around you, which is really at the heart of what you're talking about when you say gender paradigm. How did we get to this point where we basically see the world around us, including our own bodies, as as material to be formed and shaped, manipulated, harmed to create what it is we think it needs to be? Because there's a philosophical, you've got Foucault and the gang from the 60s and stuff, yeah. But I don't think the average layperson, they don't know Foucault, they don't know Lyotard and all that stuff. But nonetheless, their ideas have been profoundly impactful in getting us to this spot where there's like no intrinsic meaning to something anymore. It comes empty, and you create it. How did we get there?
Yeah, I mean I think there are philosophical movements happening before I kind of jump in the 20th century to start to tell this story. Because you could start with Descartes, or you could you could really roll it back. And, some people have, like Carl Trueman, for example, his recent book, I think, does some more of that back history. So where I start on that kind of thread is with Simone de Beauvoir. So Simone de Beauvoir was a French feminist philosopher and existentialist who wrote The Second Sex in 1949. And she doesn't use the term gender, but she does introduce the concept that gender would soon come to name. And it's exactly what you're talking about, right? So she writes in that text that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So she's making the argument that what we think of as woman is primarily a kind of cultural fabrication, and it's not something natural. She writes in there's a quote in her book that says, "Nothing is natural." And so I think that's the shift that's really happening, is the denaturalization, really of everything, but especially human nature. And that was very explicit in the existentialist philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. So they had an idea that, I'm going to forget which order it goes in. Let's see. Existence precedes essence. Essence precedes existence. Yeah, existence precedes essence. Basically, they're kind of reversing the whole framing of the classical philosophical tradition of metaphysics to say that what I am is actually secondary to the fact that I exist. So in other words, I'm not born a certain thing. I have to kind of create my own meaning. And to make my life meaningful, we have to make the world meaningful, right? So we don't live in a world where there is an intrinsic meaning and givenness to things, to the body, to human nature, right? So it's really a movement sharply away from the very idea of human nature. And that would include human nature in a sexed way in terms of man and woman. So if I had to kind of distill the philosophical turn that happens, I think it's a rejection of human nature, that there is kind of a givenness to the way we are, that we are a certain kind of being, and it is through living in harmony with our nature that we flourish. And certainly in kind of more of a Christian context, our nature is something that is created and it's given to us. It's a gift, right? So it comes with its own meaning that we can respond to. And certainly it's true that part of human nature is that we are social creatures, that we are creative, that we are able to create like elaborate societies and cultural expressions of natural things, right? So it doesn't preclude the idea that there is something true about the social construction of certain things. But where the kind of line of departure is that for many of these philosophers and gender theorists, that there is nothing under the construction, so to speak. There's only the social construction. There's nothing real underneath it in terms of an enduring nature.
Yeah. So to get this kind of to Main Street, and I think this is what caused Truman to want to write his book was this statement, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body." And I think further for him, he was asking the question, why are we assuming the body is wrong and the mind is right with regard to this? And it seems to be always the case that the body is wrong and the mind is right. How did we get to that point where we are assuming now that the body's lying to us, and it's always when they're in conflict, it's always that way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that Carl Trueman points out, I think he's one of the people who really emphasizes this, is that the mode of kind of individual expressionism that's and we were talking about gender, but there's a certain extent to which we're all shaped by this in our culture. I think this is really pronounced in social media, right? Where who you are is almost this like created, curated persona online that looks a certain way, that likes certain things, that doesn't like certain things, that has certain affiliations, right? And that becomes the true self is like what's being expressed, being expressed there. And so I think this plays out in the realm of gender, but I think it also plays out in other ways where we like, quote unquote find ourselves in kind of the consumerist modes of expression in our culture, and those are seen as like that's authentic, right?
Right.
When in fact that's actually deeply shaped. This is where I would more lean on the social constructionist side and say, no, actually, what you choose to wear and what you desire to buy and the kind of slogans you put in your bio on social media are much more shaped by society than, this authentic expression of this inner self.
Yeah, right. So this might dovetail well into this. I think you mentioned that prior to 2012, there was no scientific evidence of adolescent girls experiencing gender dysphoria or something like that. Right. And we've gone from that to at least the appearance anyway of this whole thing being a viral outbreak. What do you chalk up to being the cause or causes of the acceleration of this over the last 11 years?
Yeah, I think there are, it's like a perfect storm of different things that are happening, right? So one big factor is the development of the youth transition protocol in the Netherlands, which the initial study for that came out in 2011, I think. So this was the first formulation of taking an adolescent or pre-adolescent child, blocking puberty through chemical intervention, and then using cross-sex hormones to either masculinize or feminize the body. So that medical protocol was totally new at that point. So that was one thing. So you had this kind of the shift happening in the medical industry, which of course is then connected to the fact that this makes a lot of money, right? If you medicalize healthy young people for life, right? So there's that piece. There's the kind of conceptual revolutions that have been happening around gender, primarily in the academy, but then they're kind of percolating and trickling down into popular culture and becoming mainstream, especially in HR departments and things like that. But the factor I would point to above anything else would be the internet, would be social media. And I find 2014 is the watershed year for all of this. And there's a lot going on in 2014. But a big piece of it is the smartphone and social media and the kind of accessibility of the internet. It's no longer something that you kind of dip in and out of, but you can actually almost live there, really. You can be connected to it all the time. And also young people being immersed in that in a stage of development, which is very turbulent and very difficult, right? So that kind of confluence of all these different factors, and adolescent girls, I think, are especially prone to responding to distress in certain ways that arise to kind of a collective distress. You can see different ways historically how this is manifested. I think the eating disorders and kind of the 90s, there was kind of a self-harm epidemic earlier in the 2000s, then it sort of turned to gender stuff. So when young girls are distressed, they externalize it on themselves, right? So young men who are distressed, they tend to be violent toward others, but young women tend to be violent towards themselves. And then also there's this kind of intense peer influence factor. So I think that was happening at the same time that you had some of these theories about gender kind of trickling down into places like Tumblr and then suddenly taking on these like new forms. And Tumblr, I actually would say, is a very specific incubator for concepts of gender in that time frame, specifically around 2012. And then that's how they went mainstream, right? Like if you can remember the moment, if you're old like I am, right? You can remember the moment in 2014 when Facebook was like, and now there's 30 gender options, and that kind of seemed like it came out of nowhere. And it felt like it came out of nowhere as someone who had degrees in gender studies. I was like, wait, what? I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I remember queering, wanting to queer categories of gender. I don't remember like a list of 30 to choose from, So it was perplexing, like, where is this coming from, right? And a lot of it was coming from Tumblr and then becoming mainstream. So you have this kind of trickle down Judith Butler gender theory and then this trickle up Tumblr effect.
Right.
And then, and then it's tied. And then once it gets tied into medical professional protocols, once it gets politicized, especially after 2016, when everyone just kind of lost their minds politically and it became tribal warfare.
Right.
In the United States, and this gets sucked into that. So,
yeah.
So,
a lot of your book is tracing how we got here, and and by the way, folks, there are stories interwoven into here that you'll want to make sure that you're picking up on. So maybe this is asking too much, but where do you see this going? As you prognosticate, as you look out into the future, based on your study of the past, where does this go?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the youth transition war, if you want to use the term war, whatever, the debate around youth transition, I think that is already won, right? So we're already seeing a shift on that. All the European countries that first developed and embraced these protocols for transitioning young people have reviewed the evidence and changed their protocols. The United States, it'll take longer because we don't have a centralized healthcare system. No one's paying attention to the evidence because they just want to dunk on their political opponents, and it's being fought out in the courts. And so it'll be messier here. There'll be lawsuits. But in terms of like public opinion, in terms of even just watching like the slight shift of how the New York Times is finally acknowledging that there's been this pretty robust debate going on, especially in Europe. I think that's a sign that like things are kind of shifting on that front. So I'm actually guardedly optimistic on that particular thread, although of course there will be plenty of fallout from that, right? That will still, I think we're just really getting into some of the fallout from that. As far as the broader fad of young people experimenting with identities and pronouns and who don't medicalize, which is the majority, most young people who, say come out as non-binary or even trans these days don't necessarily medicalize. I think that I'm also guardedly optimistic that will sort of burn itself out because youth culture it moves so quickly, through phases. And so my guess is that it will start to just seem less cool pretty soon. You might have people that are like, oh yeah, I was non-binary in middle school, and then you kind of get over it. That's one optimistic take on that. I would say though, in general, I think there's a broader trend in our culture just toward transhumanism in general. So there's a broader trend toward using technology in ways that push against our natural limits. And you can see this, like AI will come into this. You can see this in terms of genetic modifications, gene editing, all those sorts of questions, right, are still going to be here. They're not going anywhere. So I think there will always be some now that the technology is on the table to, kind of alter the appearance of your body to approximate the opposite sex. Those, I don't think there will always be people who choose those options for a variety of different reasons, right? And for many of them, it's because they're just, profoundly in a state of distress and want relief from that. But in terms of the kind of youth culture, social contagion, I do see that hopefully shifting.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a good thing. That would be a good thing. The book is The Genesis of Gender. The author is Abigail Favale. And again, I highly recommend it to you. Christmas is coming. Good gift to put in a stocking. And I know the constraints on your time must be heavy because I think the book has done quite well. At least that's from all appearances, it's done quite well and been very helpful for me. And I know once we get the word out to our congregation here, it's going to be helpful to them. And so thank you for spending time talking a little bit about it and in this subject.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.